Uh, Good evening to all of you present here. I warmly welcome all of you here for the fourth session of India March for Science. So we have this is the fourth anniversary from India March for Science that we are observing in India. And I am Shreeya. I have done my MSc Physics. I've done my MSc Physics, and so for today's session, the topic, as we all know, it is Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the relevance of nuclear energy in today's world. So, due to some exigencies, due to some unavoidable reasons, today with us, Anil sir couldn't join us. So hence, I am the moderator for today. So I will start off with the session now. It is my pleasure, first of all, to welcome all of you present here to this event. The theme of this discussion, as I've already told, is Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Experiences, Nuclear Energy, Its Relevance, and Meeting Energy Requirements. You are aware that today, the 6th of August, 2020, marks the 75th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima. The 8th of August marks the same milestone for the bombing of Nagasaki. Also, Professor C.V. Raman was incensed and saddened by the bombings that he used to refer to President Truman, who ordered the bombing, as that untrue man called Truman. The first commercial nuclear power plant at Shippingport, Pennsylvania, reached its full design power in 1957. Since then, this technology was increasingly used to generate electricity to meet the growing energy demands from all across the world. At the same time, there has been nuclear proliferation to the extent that we can destroy our planet 10 times over, as if once is not enough. Initially, there was almost universal enthusiasm for nuclear energy. It was seen as pollution-free means of generating electricity. Soon, however, questions about the safe storage of the spent fuel safety of power plants were realized. Opposition to nuclear power grew. Proponents of nuclear power have claimed 100% reliability of power plants. They have ignored the fact that reliability, which is defined as a probability, can never be equal to 1. They have also ignored nuclear accidents, big and small. The 3 Mile Island, Fukushima, and the biggest of them all, Chernobyl, come to mind right away. With these in background, we have two eminent scientists and thinkers on the subject with us to enlighten us. They are Professor George Joseph and Dr. Subrat Raju. I will first introduce the panelists briefly and then describe the format of the event. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Mr. George Joseph, MSc Physics from University College, Trivandrum, Kerala, MPhil in Physics from Cochin University, Kerala. He worked as a scientist in the Radiological Safety Division of the Indira Gandhi Center for Atomic Research, Kalpakam, Tamil Nadu for 25 years. He retired from service in 2018. He has been active in science movement in Tamil Nadu and Kerala. I welcome you, Mr. George Joseph. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Dr. Suvrat Raju to this event. He has earned his PhD from Harvard in 2008. He is now a theoretical physicist at the International Center for Theoretical Sciences, which is the part of Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, TIFR. His primary research interests include quantum gravity and quantum field theory. This research has been recognized by national and international awards, including the ICTP Prize 2019, the Saraswati Kaushik Medal 2015, and the Young Scientist Medal of the Indian National Science Academy 2013. He is a prolific writer and refers to himself as an activist. His writings encompass book reviews, civil rights, nuclear armament, and many other subjects. He has written extensively on issues of nuclear energy and nuclear weapons. I welcome you, Dr. Subrat Raju. The format we will follow in this session is Professor Joseph will address us first for 20 minutes, followed by Dr. Subrat Raju for the next 20 minutes. I may then ask them to elaborate certain points from the talk. It will then be followed by the question and answer session, wherein I will present to them questions asked by our audience. This session will last around 1 hour and 30 minutes. As you can see, we have two experts who have dealt with the subject for a very long time and are ready to talk to us about it today. Over to you, Mr. George Joseph.
It is one of the darkest days in human history. A nuclear bomb was used for the first time in the city of Hiroshima. More than 150,000 people died very soon, and thousands of people continued to suffer the consequences of radiation and other diseases, radiation-induced and other diseases. It was a very tragic thing, and from videos and movies, pictures, you will see how horrible it was. The Hiroshima Museum shows all those things: school bags of school children, shoes, and other things. The event happened around 8:50 in the morning when people were going for work, school children were going to school. So it was a very busy time. So in a matter of seconds, that entire city was devastated. Even afterwards, it was seen that on a Hiroshima bridge, a print of a man was seen, meaning he was vaporized and his shadow has fallen, was imprinted on the bridge. Such was the disaster. Even you might have heard of the child Sudoku and Sudoku cranes. Today, children all over the world make these Sudoku cranes to observe the day in memory of those children. Sudoku was a girl of 2 years when the disaster happened, and she lived for another 10 years. In the last days, when she was in the hospital suffering from leukemia, her classmates brought her these paper cranes and asked her to make those cranes. It was told that if you make 1,000 cranes, it will fulfill a wish. So she started making, but around when she reached around 660, she passed away. So the children made the remaining and then buried it with her. So this day, so afterwards, in many children all over the world make these paper cranes to observe this day. Now the question is, such a disaster, such a cruel, criminal thing, was it necessary at all? If you see, I mean, the justification given is that to end the war, Second World War. As you know from the history and the documents, on May 8, Germany had surrendered to the Red Army. Hitler had committed suicide a few days before, and Japan was on the verge of surrender. And on July 26, in the Potsdam Conference of the Allied Leaders, the ultimatum to Japan was given, and Japan was also on the way to surrender. But by then, on July 16, USA had tested its first nuclear device, the Trinity test, and it was successful. So then on, USA was very much interested, was eager to use it. So even the scientists like Leo Szilard and others who are connected with, even Oppenheimer, who are connected with the Manhattan Project, they appeal that it's not necessary now. But then the decision making had gone to the administration and the army, and the scientists had no role at all. And then they went ahead. They went ahead with this, and on August 6, the first bomb was dropped in Hiroshima. If it was to end the war, was it necessary to use another one on Nagasaki, in Nagasaki on 3 days later? But then their intention was that since the first one was uranium bomb, they had another one, a plutonium bomb. So they wanted to test both. Even from the menu of the target selection committee, what we see is under a committee called Stimson Committee. The targets, the criterion for selection of the targets was that there should be the city should have sufficient population. It should be of a minimum size of 3 miles, and it should not have been damaged by earlier bombings. So this itself shows what type of a criminal objective. That is, they wanted to see what is the effect of the nuclear device. So seeing all this, a question comes to the people, and even common people, whether science, what is the objective of science? Whether science is something useful for the people or harmful for the people. Often debates are conducted in schools. Science is a boon or bane, and such things. Science is a method of analysis. Science is the method of analysis based on observation, experiment, and verification to understand the objective world. So it's a tool in the hands of humanity. So the question is, who uses it? So the result of this depends on who uses it, who wields it. So here, what we have seen is that the people who wielded it had used it for such misuse. Say, Einstein had given the equation E equal to mc square. E equal to mc square is science. E equal to mc square says mass and energy are equivalent. mass can be converted to energy. So it can be used for producing energy. It can be used also for developing as a weapon. So these questions are related to the way our society also works. So it is something to be, so how the society works, that is to be probed. And to probe that also, the only tool that we have is science. That is the objective analysis. Now coming to the question of nuclear power. As you know, in the fission process was discovered in 1938 by Lise Meitner, Otto Hahn, Fritz Strassmann, and a few others in Germany. So immediately after its discovery, the results were published in scientific journals. Scientists were interested in this. There was a lot of research going on. But by 1939, the Second World War had begun. Now, the question, there's the possibility of this fission to be used as a weapon also came up. So then the whole research in nuclear energy was steeped in secrecy. The countries which had access to research in this field was all done in secrecy. UK, United Kingdom, the USA, Germany, all they conducted this research secretly. And in 1942, Enrico Fermi could produce the first reactor. I mean, reactor means the chain reaction was possible to maintain the chain reaction or the model of a reactor. So since then, the urge for using it as a weapon grew, and the Manhattan Project, of course, already it was in place, had accelerated the process of building up a bomb. And as you have seen, in 1945, it was used. So what we have seen is, because of the weapon connection, this particular research field was restricted to very few countries, very few people. So it was not universal. So all aspects could not be explored. And till the 1950s, it was the research was, I mean, the developments were only in the field of weapon making. It was only after the 50s, after the 1950s, that the attention was drawn to the development of power. And the Soviet Union had given much attention to it. And the first commercial reactor to produce electricity was commissioned in Omnix in 1955. From then on, there were reactors were built in other countries, in USA, in France, UK, and there was tremendous interest in the development of reactors for power generation. And in 1970s, it was thought that nuclear power will be the power of the future, will be the future power, the cheapest power. So even say a country like France had invested in nuclear energy to a big extent. Even today, almost 70% of its power generation is from nuclear power. There are other countries also. So today, even around 440 reactors are running, producing almost around 10% of the world's nuclear electricity needs. But in 1986, when the Chernobyl accident happened, there was a big setback. People realized that there is a danger and accidents are possible. And accidents in a nuclear station, a nuclear plant is not like other plants. If it is in a coal plant, after the accident, it can be closed or, but then in the case of a nuclear plant, an accident does not stop with that. It's the radioactive products spread to nearby areas and even farther places, and the radioactive waste continue to be a big hazard for thousands of years. So it's a big issue. So after that, after 1986, the need for increasing the safety, and that needed higher investments, and the cost of nuclear power drastically increased. Then again, the question of safety as well as the spent fuel management, the waste that is generated, that is also in a huge quantity. So that cannot be, that also will remain for thousands and thousands of years. What to do with that? It cannot be easily disposed of. And if it has to be, of course, nowadays methods for disposing are being developed, but still it is, and that becomes very costly. And so most of the countries are just keeping it as it is, storing it. So now these issues are a question before the further development of nuclear power. And meanwhile, we know that there is much development in the field of other conventional sources like wind energy, solar. For example, in India, the wind energy is producing almost 10%, and solar maybe around 8% or so. So in the whole world, there is now much interest towards this non-conventional sources. Whereas in India, for example, the nuclear power is only hardly 3%, even after investing so much and for so many years. So now there is, so due to all these factors, now there is less, there's not that much of interest for developing the nuclear power. Of course, research is going on to develop fusion reactors. Of course, that is still much far away, it looks like. So now, in the present scenario, in the world over, there is reduced interest for nuclear power and its capacities. I mean, of course, not many new reactors are being built. Again, as I mentioned earlier, if the nuclear energy research was not bound by this by the weapons relation, probably the world over, in the 50s itself, many countries would have opted and research would have been conducted all over the world. Maybe the problems that we are facing today could have been recognized earlier, and we would have chosen a different option, or even if it was possible to solve it, we would have continued. So the science, technology, its development is also related to the society, social condition, societies, how it is working, how it is controlled. So these are also very important questions for the advancement of science. So I think as members of the India March for Science, our concern should be for the advancement of science the best way possible, to free it from all kinds of tentacles, to free it from the the obstruction due to the societal restrictions, and free science for the for the benefit of mankind. With this, I conclude.
Thank you, Mr. George Joseph, sir. It was very insightful. Many of your points that you have told gave us new insight into the history of nuclear power, how it has come about, and many other things about the nuclear power plant. Very insightful, sir. Thank you. Now we can move on to Mr. Dr. Subrat Raju. So you can continue for the next 20 minutes, sir, after which we will take up the questions. Sir, you're on mute.
Okay, thank you. Can you see my screen?
Yes, sir, you're visible. Are you sharing the screen? Your screen is not visible.
The screen is not visible?
No.
Not visible.
Not visible.
Oh, 1 second. Now
yes, sir. Now, yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. So I hope it's full screen now.
Yes, sir. It's full screen.
Okay. So thank you very much, first of all, to India March for Science Karnataka for hosting this discussion and for inviting me to speak here. So Mr. George Joseph spoke very movingly about the issue of nuclear weapons and the disaster that the criminal disaster that the dropping of the atom bomb on Hiroshima was. So I thought I would address a slightly different question, and I would focus on the question of nuclear energy. But of course, I would be happy in the questions to come back to the issue of nuclear weapons, and also actually on the important issue of the link between nuclear energy and nuclear weapons, which also I think is not discussed enough. But for now, for this talk, for my 20 minutes, I would like to focus on a specific issue. And the issue is whether nuclear energy is an answer for India or whether it is not an answer for India. So I would like to say, of course, just to give a preview, and perhaps it's not surprising that that I will say this. I would like to say, of course, that I think nuclear energy is not the correct answer for India. And I think that there are two main reasons which were already touched upon slightly in the previous talk. And those two main reasons have to do with the cost of nuclear energy and issues of safety. But apart from talking about this, I would also like to focus on a slightly different issue, which is that as part of India March for Science, we are not only scientists, but people who are we are also trying in a sense to engage with issues of public policy. And so one of the points I would like to bring out in this discussion is how the debate on nuclear issues that has taken place in the country over the past 10 or 15 years also gives us hints about the right kinds of strategies to adopt when we look at public action and look at the interface between science and public action, and also how it informs us about the nature of the state that we are dealing with. So that's a rough overview of what I'm going to say. Let me just start by saying a little bit more about the history of nuclear energy. One of the striking things about nuclear energy in India has been how badly it has failed to live up to its promise. In particular, if you look at announcements that were made, for instance, at the time of the Indo-US nuclear deal or earlier, there are multiple grand announcements about how nuclear energy will give very large fractions of India's nuclear energy, of India's energy requirements. But in fact, over the last 30 years or so, which is a very long time period, and even earlier, nuclear energy has very consistently been between 2 to 4% of total electricity generation in the country. So this is actually a graph of electricity generation by nuclear power compared to total electricity generation. And you can see it's very consistent between 2 to 4%. Sometimes it goes a little lower and sometimes a little higher, but mostly it's always at about 3%. So I think that's the first thing to realize, that in a sense, nuclear energy has been a rather irrelevant part of India's energy mix. Nevertheless, the reason we continue to discuss nuclear energy is because successive governments, the UPA government, the NDA government before that, have repeatedly announced plans for nuclear expansion. If you go and you look at parliamentary documents, you will find that the current plans for nuclear expansion are as follows. That there are a number of reactors which are under construction, then there are reactors which have been awarded financial sanction, and then there are a number of reactors which have been in principle approved to be imported from other countries, which are the reactors in Jaithapur, in Kovada, in Mitivedi, and in Haripur even. You can also look at a map of where these reactors are going to be, and you will see they really cover the entire country. The red reactors here are the imported reactors, and the blue reactors here are the indigenous reactors. But you see that they cover the entire coastline and also are in some parts of the middle of India. So, if these plans were really to come to fruition, you would have, nuclear reactors dotting all parts of India. And that's why I think it's still an important question to ask. Even though nuclear energy is a small part of India's energy mix today, is still an important question to ask about whether nuclear energy and all these reactors that are being planned are actually the right answer or whether they are not the right answer. So, as I said, I think there are two main issues which we should focus on. There are many issues related to nuclear energy, but I think in the case of India, there are two main issues. One has to do with issues of cost, and the other has to do with issues of safety. So I'd like to explain both of those in turn. So the first question is the question of cost. So there is a central principle of what one might call nuclear economics, which one should keep in mind when one discusses cost. And that is that a nuclear reactor, if you compare it with, say, coal or another source of energy, conventional source of energy, is different in that it has very large initial capital costs, but then it doesn't necessarily have very high costs for fuel. So if you compare nuclear with coal, you will see the nuclear reactor has very large initial capital costs, but then the fuel is cheaper than the fuel for coal. So that means that if you want to compare the cost of electricity from a nuclear reactor to a coal reactor, the key issue is, first of all, what is the capital cost? How much did you have to pay upfront? And the second issue is, what is the interest rate? Because you see, if there is a very high interest rate and then the capital cost is high, you're not only paying the capital upfront, you have to also pay the interest on that capital. And therefore, that also matters when you're trying to make a comparison across time scales, as one does when one looks at the cost of electricity from nuclear power, from nuclear reactors. So in principle, these interest rates and so on are set. They are mandated by the Central Electricity Regulatory Commission. And so if one were to give a capital cost, one can calculate using publicly available data what is the cost to consumers of electricity. This is a calculation that we did several years ago. It's a very simple calculation, but you can go and look it up. And it's a rather straightforward calculation that tells you that if one gives the capital cost in terms of the price of nuclear electricity per kilowatt generation, then the unit cost will be rupees per kilowatt hour, which is on the y-axis. Okay. So now where does one get the capital cost from? In fact, there is a lot of contemporary data on what the capital costs of nuclear reactors are. For instance, as I said, there are plans to import these reactors in Jaithapur, these very large reactors in Jaithapur. These same reactors, these are called the European pressurized reactors, are also being built in France, in Finland, and there is data on how much they're going to cost. And it looks like each of these reactors, which is about a 1.6 gigawatt reactor, will cost $12 billion. Similarly, there are plans to import what are called AP1000 reactors built by a company called Westinghouse. When Trump visited India in February, for instance, these plans were put on the table again. We have data from the United States on how much these reactors will cost, and this suggests that each of these reactors could cost as much as $10 billion for 1,000 megawatts. So now, we could say cost in India will be lower, and so we'll assume that construction cost in India will be 25% lower. In the list that I showed you, we also had other reactors. We had the reactors being built at Kudankulam, for which we have an estimate, and that estimate is about 20,000 crores for each 1,000 megawatt reactor. Then there are these indigenous reactors, like the reactors being built at Gorakhpur. We have a capital cost estimate for those as well, which is about 10,000 crores for 700 megawatts. So the point is that, for all of these reactors, we do have a sense of how much the capital cost will be. So you can use this as an input and compute what is the expected cost of electricity from these reactors. So we did that, and this is what one finds. The red dots are the different reactors. So the Gorakhpur reactor is the indigenous reactor which the NPCIL will build, but even that will lead to a tariff of about 9 rupees per unit. The Kudankulam reactors are being built by Russia, but even those, if you look at the capital cost previously, will come out to about 12 rupees per unit. The EPR reactors and the AP1000 reactors will be even more expensive. The EPR at something like 21 rupees a unit and the AP1000 at something like 29 rupees a unit. This is a very simple calculation. As I said, you can go look up our calculations and repeat this. So using publicly available data, it is already enough sufficient to give us a pretty good estimate of how expensive nuclear electricity will be. In particular, one of the things this tells us is that this electricity is much more expensive than other competing sources of electricity. I should also say that in these calculations, I have ignored some other subsidies that are given to nuclear power. For instance, there are subsidies that have to do with the interest rate that the government charges for the for loans to nuclear, for loans to the NPCIL and so on. And I'm ignoring these other subsidies, and I'm also ignoring the fact that the NPCIL may end up selling cheaper electricity by transferring some costs to the taxpayer because it's a public sector company. But if you really look at what the cost should be by CERC norms, this is what the cost should be. And so there is a very simple conclusion, which I think all of us should keep in mind. It's a completely unambiguous conclusion, and that is as follows. It tells us that the costs of nuclear energy are much higher than the costs of competing sources of electricity. Those of us who follow the electricity market know that for things like solar power, bids are between 2 to 4 rupees per unit and nothing like 9 to 29 rupees a unit. And so, sometimes people say we should put a price on carbon because nuclear energy is, doesn't release so much CO2. But whatever price one puts on carbon, there is a very simple fact which cannot be questioned, which is that nuclear energy is not an economical alternative in India. So that's the first conclusion. The second issue, as I said, I wanted to discuss was the issue of safety. So as John Joseph also mentioned, a significant danger with nuclear reactors is that there could be a serious accident of the kind that happened in Chernobyl or Fukushima. In Chernobyl, this is a map of the area that got contaminated. And in fact, an area which is of the size of about Goa, which is a very, very large area if you think of it, still remains out of bounds in Chernobyl. In Fukushima, about 160,000 people had to be evacuated from their homes when the accident happened. Now, in India, the situation is that we have very high population density, and we also have very high dependence on land. It is a very different situation from the situation in Ukraine or Belarus or the former Soviet Union, because one cannot just say that we will displace people from an area which is the size of Goa and resettle them somewhere else. That's something that is just impossible in India. We also have very poor emergency and health services, unlike a place like Japan, and therefore the consequences of an accident can be much more serious. And so I think this is the second thing to realize, that nuclear energy can not only does it carry a risk of serious accidents, in India, given the peculiar conditions in India, or given the conditions which are relevant to India, this risk is much, much more serious than it might be in, say, Australia or somewhere else. Now, actually, I feel that sometimes when people discuss issues of nuclear energy, of nuclear safety, they tend to get into some very, arcane technical debates about the kinds of safety mechanisms that are put into reactors. So, in fact, I wanted to give what I sometimes call a dummy's guide to nuclear safety. And that actually has to do with the legal regime that surrounds the consequences of an accident in India. So the nuclear industry has actually created some special laws to protect itself from the consequences of an accident. Not to protect other people, because you cannot protect people from the consequences, but the industry wants to make sure that it itself is protected. And this, I think, functions as a guide to safety, because it tells you that the industry is itself worried about accidents and wants to make sure that it doesn't suffer any of the consequences. So I'd like to describe this law a little bit and then explore some consequences for public action. So when one thinks about a nuclear accident, I think one should think of a three-way conflict. You have the accident itself, which leads to damage, and then there are three entities that are involved. One is, of course, the victims who suffer the damage. Then there is the supplier of the nuclear plant. In the case of imported reactors, this supplier might be some company, some multinational company like Westinghouse, which is supplying reactors. And then there is the operator of the nuclear plant, which is the utility company that is operating the plant. In India's case, this would be the Nuclear Power Corporation of India. So when the Indo-US, for a long time, this issue was not settled because, in India, the government was supplying and operating the plants. But when the nuclear reactor market was opened up at the time of the Indo-US nuclear deal, multinational corporations wanted to be indemnified from the consequence of a nuclear accident. So they are the ones on top. And they wanted to make sure if an accident happens, that they don't suffer in any way. So there was, of course, in India, significant opposition to the idea that India should indemnify a multinational supplier because of the history of the Bhopal accident. But nevertheless, in spite of this, the government of India not only acceded to the demand of the multinational corporations, they acceded to it so completely that they just took an annexure of a certain instrument that the US has created called the Convention on Supplementary Compensation. They literally just borrowed the appendix of that international document and they turned it into a law in India. So because they borrowed the appendix, except for one small quirk, which I'll come to, the Indian law largely meets the principles which are laid out by the demands from the US and other Western European corporations. What are those guidelines? The guidelines are, first of all, and these are screenshots from the Indian law. I'm not making this up. This is really from the Indian law. It's a screenshot from there. The first principle of the law is that the operator of the installation will be liable for nuclear damage. That means that the supplier of the installation, the multinational company, will not be liable, but the liability will only be channeled to the Indian Public Sector Nuclear Power Corporation of India. That is one of the first most important clauses in the law. The second is, even this liability is capped. It is capped at some figure called 300 million special drawing rights because the US had that figure in its appendix. But in India, it is capped at rupees 1,500 crores for the operator. Rupees 1,500 crores is a very small amount compared to the kind of damage that a nuclear accident could really cause. It's like 1,000th of the kind of economic damage a nuclear accident could cause. But even this public sector company, which has to bear the liability, doesn't have to pay any more than this very small amount. And the rest is for the victims to pay on their own. However, as I said, there was a small quirk in the law. And the small quirk is that at some point, the Indian law differs from this appendix that they copied. And it includes two words which are not there in this appendix, in this Convention on Supplementary Compensation. And those two words are the following. It says that, well, in some situations, the new operator of a nuclear installation, not the victims, but the NPCIL, might have a chance to recover some of this 1,500 crores it paid from the supplier, which is Westinghouse or some multinational corporation, if the accident resulted from gross negligence. And those are the words that are underlined. So this gross negligence clause was not included in the Convention on Supplementary Compensation. And when the multinational US corporations heard about this, they went wild. And it caused such great consternation that this is actually a quote that one of their legal analysts gave to the Hindu on 8 March 2010. You can look it up. It said, what is this gross negligence? The difference between negligence, gross negligence, and willful act is as clear as the difference between a fool, a damn fool, and a goddamn fool. And this is, I'm sorry to use unparliamentary language, but this was published on the front page of the Hindu because this is really the way the multinational industry reacted to just the inclusion of two words that it did not want included in the law. So what happened is then, well, the government is very sensitive when the multinational corporations say something. So it went to the standing committee of the parliament and they made a recommendation. They said, well, okay, we should remove that gross negligence, but we should strengthen it to say, the operator will have a right of recourse when the nuclear incident has resulted as a consequence of the act of the supplier, etc., etc. But by the way, we should also insert "and" on top. So, it's a small clause which says, well, we should modify the law, and it seems like it's making it stronger, but actually we'll insert this "and" on top. So if you now read the whole clause, it says, well, the operator for nuclear installation will be able to have a right of recourse when such right is explicitly provided for in contract in writing. That means when the multinational corporation explicitly accepts that it will accept liability. That's the only situation under which you can have any right of recourse. So, of course, this created an outcry when this happened. People complained and said, what do you mean by putting an "and" here? And so the cabinet went to the cabinet, and the cabinet said, yes, this "and" is very bad. We'll delete it. But let's put the "and" at the end of clause B. So now you should read how the law reads. It said, well, the operator will have a right of recourse when the nuclear incident has resulted from the act of a supplier, and it has resulted from an act of commission done with the intent to cause nuclear damage. That means only if the supplier wanted to cause an accident, you have a right of recourse. So this is even more absurd than what happened previously. Also tells you the kinds of gymnastics the government did to please multinational corporations. But of course, this didn't fly, and because there was so much of an outcry, they had to delete this clause as well. And so now the clause just reads what it is without having this end. However, there's something I think which is quite curious, which is when the BJP was in the opposition, it criticized these developments and correctly criticized these developments. In fact, Arun Jaitley, who was leading the BJP parliamentary party at that time, he said, what is this and, putting this and here and there? A leopard never changes its spots, and the government is constantly trying to dilute the right of recourse to please these multinational corporations. But as he said correctly, a leopard never changes its spots. So when the BJP came to power, they decided to do exactly the same thing. So when Obama visited India in 2015, the Ministry of External Affairs issued a frequently asked questions, again trying to interpret the Indian law and saying that, well, actually, we will not hold multinational suppliers to account after more than 5 years. The problem is, however, that even though both the BJP and the Congress, the India and the Congress, have done all of these gymnastics to try and please multinational suppliers, in the end, the law is what it is, and multinational suppliers are worried that the Indian law may expose them to liability, and so they also worry about setting a precedent for other countries. And it is as a result of this, primarily as a result of this, and also issues of cost, that we should realize that the Indo-US nuclear deal, which was launched with such great fanfare now 15 years ago, has not led to the import of even a single reactor in 15 years. And I think that is really a sobering realization if we think about it. So this is the conclusion I would like to make, because I think I'm probably out of time. I think the fact is that nuclear energy suffers from high costs and the risk of catastrophic accidents. It has also failed to scale up to meet the country's energy needs. It has consistently been between 2 to 4% of the country's energy production. There is, a very multinational-friendly liability law that exists in India, but it still doesn't completely satisfy multinational suppliers. And for this reason, the multinational suppliers are unwilling to sell reactors to India. Now, for us, what is relevant is that this entire debate functions as a dummy's guide to safety. Even if you don't understand anything about nuclear reactors, one should appreciate that if these reactor vendors believe that their reactors are so safe, then why are they so reluctant to take this very small clause in the Indian law that might place some liability on them? They should just gradually accept liability. In fact, they should accept triple liability, because they claim that their reactors are, as was said in the beginning of this talk, 100% safe. They can never have an accident. And so they should not bother about how much liability they will accept. And the fact that they do bother, and they bother so much, tells us that there is a real very high risk of an accident from a nuclear reactor. And so I think on these two counts, the counts of high costs and the risks of catastrophic accidents, it is absolutely clear that nuclear energy is not the answer for India. Just one last point I'd like to make is that I think this also holds a lesson, this entire debate and saga holds a lesson for how we can approach public action as people who are engaged with science and society. I think by focusing on some of these issues that sometimes might seem archaic, the issue of the liability law, but by focusing on these issues, and there was a lot of public action and a lot of activism that went into ensuring that the government couldn't put an and here or couldn't put an and there. I related it very fast, but there was really a lot of work that went into that many activists were involved in. And I think this really successfully stalled the import of some nuclear reactors, despite very strong push and very strong multinational interests trying to push these sales. And so I think this issue deserves attention, because it really serves as an example of successful public action, in a sense, the fact that we have been able to stop and stall the construction of some of these nuclear reactors. And I think it also serves, in a sense, as something revealing, because it reveals the priorities of the state and the extent to which the state will go and be willing to sell out our interests unless we have very strong activism to stop it. But in this case, I think there is some hope, and there is something we can cheer about in this issue of nuclear energy. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much for listening.
Yes, Dr. Suvrat sir, very insightful. You have given all points, taking into consideration the laws and what it takes to actually open up a nuclear power plant in India, or just in general, what it takes to build a power plant in any country, with all the safety measures and taking into consideration all the safety measures and the other factors that come into play. So now it is time for the taking questions from the audience. As you both were speaking, I've noted down some questions here and also taken some questions from audiences who have previously written to us. So I would like to first address George Joseph, sir. One question to you. What would you say about Einstein, sir? He had felt very bad about his equation E is equal to mc square being not used in a very proper manner, not for the help of human society, but rather in the destruction when Hiroshima and Nagasaki occurred. So could you just comment on that, sir?
Yeah, so initially, before when the war was going on, even of course Einstein, Leo Szilard, and Einstein had written a letter to the President Roosevelt that Germany maybe, because at that time it was already known that nuclear, the fission reaction was known, and then possibility of weapon development also was there. So Germany was already, actually the fission process was discovered in by Germans. So Germany might be going ahead with that program. So Einstein and Leo Szilard and few others had written a letter to Roosevelt. But then once after May 8, when Germany had surrendered, the very same people, Leo Szilard and others, they petitioned. They asked. They petitioned to the president. President, that now there is no. It is not necessary to even use it, and even Oppenheimer, even and the other scientists, even within the Manhattan Committee, they even suggested that we can have a test, meaning we can openly demonstrate. But by then, the whole control had gone into the administration and army, and their aim was totally different. So actually, Einstein repented for it later. And even this Oppenheimer, after the war, when he was involved in, and he was very much interested in developing it for peace, and he was against further development of weapons. He was arrested, and he was even arrested as for un-American activities. So such was the situation. So Einstein regretted it. That's true.
Yes, sir. So next question to Mr. Suvrat, sir. Like if all safety protocols are maintained, sir, if all India maintains all kinds of safety protocols, would you say that nuclear energy is a viable option in our country? If all protocols and everything that you have said, considered, is all maintained, made it cost effective and given a less amount of subsidy, do you think it's still a very viable option for our country?
Yeah, sorry. I think the issue of nuclear safety is not an issue of protocols, so to say. If one looks at the Fukushima accident, there were, of course, known weaknesses with the reactor design, but it is not like, some protocol failed. There was an exceptional event which caused a massive accident. And so I think it is important that you can put in place some protocols, but those protocols always leave open the possibility that there might be something, a tsunami, an earthquake, some other human error, which could cause an accident. This is if you look at the airline industry or any other industry. So there is the chance of an accident, which we cannot rule out. And as Mr. George Joseph also said, when an accident happens, the cost is very high. If you look at what happened in Chernobyl, it really kept, made a very large area, as large as the size of Goa, just inaccessible to human beings. And in India, that is impossible. When we have displacement, people suffer tremendously. But the displacement of the kind we have seen for projects is nothing of the kind of an entire area the size of Goa has been displaced. And so in India, with high population density, that risk is just something that we cannot take. As for the issue of cost, I think that, it's important that one should be practical. And the practical fact is that the cost of nuclear energy has been rising, and the cost of renewables has been falling. And so nuclear energy, which at some point of time they said would be too cheap to meter, is now too expensive to matter. and it has just become much more expensive. And if tomorrow there is some breakthrough of some kind which makes nuclear energy cheap, then we should reconsider it. But there is no such breakthrough on the cards. There is nothing of this kind. So I think on grounds of both cost and safety, nuclear energy is not a viable option. I mean, one just looking realistically and practically at issues. Can I say one?
Okay, sir.
The previous thing I just wanted to mention.
Sure.
Previous question. I think that it's we should, especially since we are scientists, I think we should also examine some of the responsibility that scientists had. For instance, people like Oppenheimer and so on. We hear many times. I'm sure all of us have heard that. When he saw the explosion, he recited some shlokas from the Bhagavad Gita. But the thing is that actually Oppenheimer was also a member of the so-called target committee that met to decide which are the cities that should be targeted and should be blown up. And these people, if you look at the minutes, these are now declassified documents, which one can see on the National Security Archives. You will see that were very inhumanly sitting and calculating, one shouldn't blow up Kyoto, or one should blow up Hiroshima because there are mountains around it and those will focus the explosion and more people will die. So unfortunately, it is a fact that a lot of scientists were very involved and were very guilty and culpable also for what happened. People like Norman Ramsay, people like Oppenheimer, and some of them later, maybe had some ill feeling, but that is not enough for, I think, the extent of their involvement, not just in the scientific process, but in further processing, including the issue of targeting. There was a target committee which comprised scientists as well, and these people were involved, and I think, they should not escape opprobrium for that.
Okay, sir. Yes, definitely. This weight lies on history itself, and this accident has given us a better understanding of how our future should be with respect to nuclear energy. So next question to Mr. George Joseph, sir. Would you say, sir, there is this nuclear energy or nuclear energy, what we say, it's a double-edged sword, sir? Would you say that? And would you say there is some relationship between nuclear power and a nuclear bomb?
Actually, both uses the same material. That is the thing. So the relation is that both uses the same material, uranium and plutonium. So that is the problem. So initially, if when the fission was discovered, if it was not at all very useful for our weapon development, definitely it would have been it would have been a subject of research all over the world, and probably it would have been much beneficial. So the connection between is only the material, not that. And again, to produce the weapon, it's not. You need to have the fuel. That material, that is plutonium and uranium, that can be created only in reactors. So again, that is part of the. Of course, power reactors may be separated, but still, it is part of the process. So that way, it is. That is why. There was a restriction for countries to use it, because some countries may use it for developing weapons. So those few countries which had initial access, they completely monopolized it and stopped any other country from developing even the nuclear power.
Can I also add?
Sir. Yes, please, sir. Please.
I completely agree with what you said. In fact, there's another equation which Paul Dirac first wrote down in 1941, which tells us that if you're trying to enrich uranium, there's some separative work units, there's some work you need to put in, and that can be used to enrich a large amount of uranium to a small extent, so produce a large amount of lightly enriched uranium, or produce a small mass of highly enriched uranium, which you would use in a bomb. So it's exactly the same process that goes into the reactor and the bomb. And it's so closely linked that from our own history, in our own constituent assembly debates, Jawaharlal Nehru was once asked, how will you differentiate between research for nuclear energy and research for nuclear reactors? And his answer, which is on record, is, I do not know how you are to distinguish between the two. So one cannot distinguish between the two. And this was known to many people, including Eisenhower, when he launched this Atoms for Peace program. So nuclear energy and nuclear power are very closely linked. It is a dual-use technology, and we just cannot get away from that. And this is something that we should realize. So nuclear energy does also carry with it the risk that it will lead to nuclear weapons, and there's no way to get away from that.
Yes, sir. Thank you. So I'll just combine one of the live comments, live questions that we have got with another question from our audience that we have previously received. So this question is open to both of you. You can either of you can answer. So what would you say is the sustainable source of energy for the future? And would you say solar energy, which is taking the center stage right now, is the more viable option at the current scenario?
Maybe Professor Subrat Raju can answer first.
Yeah, I think certainly one should put a lot of hope in renewables, including solar, and that is something which one, I mean, certainly in terms of energy production, one should put hope in that. I think there is also one more thing which I think we should realize. The issue of energy is not only an issue of how do we produce more and more and more without limit. At some point, we also have to ask a question about what is the kind of lifestyle that we would like to lead. Is it really required that we have an infinite amount of electricity? So in many places, I think there are some deeper questions that we also need to ask about how we need to organize society. So of course we need electricity, but we don't need an infinite amount of electricity. So we shouldn't frame the question only as, how can we keep producing electricity without limit, because we cannot. There is no process that will do that without damaging the environment in an irretrievable manner. So I think renewables are certainly something hopeful, and certainly should be a very important part and more important part of the country's energy mix and of the energy mix of all countries in the world. But I think we also need to ask about conservation aims and how to reduce consumption, and that is also an important thing that we do need to address.
One more point I wish to add. Now, a lot of money is spent for developing a fusion reactor. That ITER. It's an effort of several nations, spending several billions of dollars. Now we have the biggest fusion reactor, that is the sun. So if you spend that much of money in trying to harness that will yield much more result than spending so huge for developing a fusion reactor. So that way our priorities should change. Yes.
Yes, sir. True. So I'll just go through. I'm just going through the comment section. Yes, there is this question by Mr. Lokesh Madure. Can atomic energy be cheaper than solar energy and other alternative energies? Has been answered already, sir, during the time of the webinar. And there is one question by Mrs. Rupa Subhash. She asks, will India have, or actually the question should be, does India have the infrastructure to deal with radioactive wastes, even if it is successful to install a nuclear power plant? I think on this question, we need to deal a little bit more than, just this question, because radioactive waste is very vast, again, a very vast concern. It's a very big concern. So even in those countries where we have this radioactive waste, what would you say is the best measure to take care of this radioactive waste in the future?
Would you like to go first?
Yeah, anyone.
You proceed.
I'm not. I feel that it is certainly a very important question and very relevant issue, and I feel that we don't really have a good solution to the issue of waste that is produced from nuclear reactors. People say, and sometimes in India there's the talk that we'll recycle it, we'll run it once more through the fuel cycle, but in the end we will be left with high-level waste, of which the fact is which will be radioactive for thousands of years, and we don't really have a good way to deal with it. Some of the ways that people talk about are building a deep geological repository and putting it there. But that's not really, something that has ever been done or tried, and we don't know if it will be stable over such long periods. The best kinds of solution people have are, you put them in dry casts or something like that. But those are really temporary solutions. So I think the fact is that not only us, there is really no good solution to the issue of radioactive waste, and it is a serious problem that is just a significant problem for nuclear energy, and to which I think humanity doesn't have a solution. I mean, it's one more reason why we should be very careful about expanding nuclear energy greatly, because then we will also expand the waste production. And so far we have dealt with it on a piecemeal basis, because it's only been about 50, 60 years or 70 years since nuclear energy has been there. But it's a problem that will pile up over time, and we don't know what to do with it.
Yes, true. It is the biggest problem now, actually. And as far as nuclear power is concerned, waste management is the biggest problem, and it has not been resolved anywhere, not only in our country, in other countries also. So most of the countries which have been running reactors for long, they are just storing it and keeping. So even in Fukushima, what has happened is that because it is a private company, they did not even want to move it out. So and even the waste remained within the reactor compound. So that actually added to the accident damage. So entire thing was spread out. So as on now, there is no solution for it. Of course, it is very difficult to also find a solution. So we have to look for other alternatives rather than looking for a solution in this direction. It is quite difficult, because it's not that the thing is that the waste has to be managed for thousands of years, and to utilize it, it will be much more costlier than building a reactor. That is the problem.
Yes, sir. So we have another question from Mr. Satish Kumar. Is reducing transmission and distribution costs more beneficial than exploring new energy sources? How does India compare with other countries? I think, yeah.
A little bit. Yeah. Certainly there are significant transmission losses. But of course, one thing to remember in India is that transmission losses are losses that are not accounted for. So if somebody is actually getting the electricity in some way, that electricity is being put to productive use, but the utility company is not getting the price of that, and so that is also counted as a transmission loss. Of course, there are also real losses, and it is important to reduce transmission losses. And as I said, when one speaks of conservation efforts, that is the first, in some sense, low-hanging fruit that should be addressed. The issue of transmission and distribution losses should be addressed. But that is in some sense, if you look at the growth of electricity, that itself is not sufficient in the long run. In the long run, it will not be sufficient to just address transmission and distribution losses, because those are not, those are benefits, but those are not enough to offset the demand completely. So in the longer run, we need different solutions, which have to be in terms of reducing our electricity consumption and also looking to alternative sources of energy. But of course, it is important, as everyone will agree, to reduce transmission and distribution costs. With just one note of caution, which is that there are very large figures that are sometimes given in India, but those have to do with accounting and losses to utility companies, which may also have to do with things like corruption and so on, but are not always what one would scientifically call losses. They're not transmission losses scientifically, they're losses of accounting. I completely agree. Of course, everyone will agree that one should reduce transmission and distribution losses.
Okay, sir. Sir George, do you have any comments on this? Would you like to go?
I think Professor Suvrat has already given an answer for it.
Sure. Okay, sir. So the next, we can move on to the next question, which is, it's more of a comment. They're asking for more of a comment than an actual question. So what Mr. Vishnu says is that, he says that the nuclear waste compared to the solar or wind energy industries that produce is much lesser than these two industries, that is the solar and wind. And many of these wastes that are produced by the solar and wind industries, they have, there are much of non-recyclable wastes that are produced. So equally, this is also damaging. I think what he means is, So so according to Sir, he says that nuclear energy will have to take a center stage rather than solar and wind energies. So he's asking a comment about it. I think you've already answered these questions. You can go.
The thing is that it's true that if you look at the total volume of waste, it may not be very large. Maybe the volume of waste, if all of India's nuclear energy may fill up a few Olympic-sized swimming pools. So you may say, well, it's a small amount of waste compared to some other waste. But the thing is, this is radioactive waste that is very hard to dispose of. You cannot just dispose it of somewhere else, and it will stay radioactive for thousands of years. So if you're saying it is less compared in terms of volume, yes, it is less, but it's very dangerous and difficult to deal with, and one has to deal with it for very long terms. So it is not just absolute volume that matters. It is also the kind of waste, and in that way, nuclear waste is very different compared to other industries.
True, sir, because this concept of half-life that comes here in the case of nuclear fusion and radioactive waste. So we have another question by Mr. Satish Kumar. He says, there is so much of hype on nuclear energy. Is there something else that is in work as to why this is so much in hype? Are people not focusing on the all these other parts like the waste management and the other factors that come into play? Why are these not put out in the society? Why is there so much of hype? But just because it is clean, it's a clean energy. That's what we hear every day. So since it's a very clean source of energy, there's much hype on it, and whereas the other factors just get pushed away. Why do you think that is the case?
Would you like to go ahead? I can say something.
You can proceed.
I think that in India there was a lot of hype, and I think the hype was not a scientific hype. It had to do with the fact that with several facts. But from 2005 to now, it's about 15 years. There's been a lot of discussion of nuclear energy because it became a major foreign policy issue. It became a major, it became the flagship of some kind of Indo-US agreement, and there was a very large amount of many claims that were made at that time about how much Indian nuclear capacity. I think it was supposed to be 650 gigawatts by 2050 or some absurd number, none of which has come true. And that was just meant because there was so much criticism of the deal that there were all these unrealistic expectations which were created. So some of the hype clearly was because it became an important foreign policy issue. I think that is one reason for the hype. The second reason is I think it's true that the capital costs associated with nuclear plants are very large. And so the deals that are involved are very large. And so there are also very significant interests that are involved with it. I mean, if you look at every presidential visit that the US president makes, this AP1000 reactor keeps coming back on the table. And the reason is, again, because the amounts involved are so large. If each reactor is going to cost $10 billion and they're going to sell a number of those reactors, that's a very large sale. And these companies are in deep trouble. And in the case of Westinghouse, but these companies are in deep trouble. And so if there is a sale of this magnitude, which has such large upfront capital costs, that also generates hype with it. So I think there is a foreign policy issue. There is the fact that there are very large capital costs involved, which creates this hype. Thirdly, I think there is also the issue of the link with nuclear weapons. I think the nuclear bomb and the nuclear weapons, which are tied, at least which are really tied to nuclear energy issues, also contribute to creating the hype and the profile that the nuclear energy has. So I think there are these three issues.
Yes, sir. George, sir, do you have any inputs? Would you like to give any inputs on this?
Yeah, this hype is not any. I mean, it is just an artificial thing. I mean, of course, you know that in every country, the people in power, they will try to project certain things which are not real and which are for their own interests. So that is happening in every case, not only in this case. Any issue, certain hypes are created only to divert the attention to non-real things. That is correct.
Yes. Yes, sir. So we have a question from Pajul Shastri, madam. She says, what is India currently doing with its nuclear waste? So I think Professor Subrat Raju can take this question. Sir, yeah.
Yes, I think there is, I think there are various levels. I think that there is some dry cast storage in Tarapur and Kalpakam, and there is also India reprocesses its waste. But I think eventually the solution that I know is that there is dry cast storage. I mean, there is some which is temporarily stored, then there are pools, but the medium term solution I think is that there's dry cast storage at Kalpakam and at Tarapur. But maybe Mr. George Joseph can add to this.
Yes.
Yeah. So in India, I mean, compared to other countries, the waste is not that huge. So as on now, the power reactor waste are stored in storage facilities. Then part of it, of course, is also reprocessed. When, for example, in Kalpakam, there is a reprocessing plant to reprocess. But then reprocessing also is a big issue. I mean, it's also not an easy thing, because that also is because it is handling waste. And again, at the end of it also, it's not that completely the waste is totally destroyed or anything. It's only things that from the the fuel waste, the uranium and plutonium are extracted and again when extracted for use. The other radioactive waste will still remain, so that's also to be again handled. So it's not that easy. So as on now, major portion is actually stored. The remaining, so some portion is reprocessed, and of course there is a attempt to increase the reprocessing capacities. That is the stage.
Okay, sir. Yes. So the next question is from Bhimsen Rao Deshpande. He says, Sun is the biggest fusion reactor that we have. So is it possible to set up fusion reactors in the country? And if so, how many fusion reactors are there in our country at the present?
There's no fusion reactor in the whole world. Now there is an attempt that a group of countries, European Union, Japan, USA, Germany, all, I mean, in France, in Cadarache, they have set up a project called ITER, which they are trying, I mean, so that is a test facility for fusion reactor. So that also maybe in 2025, there, I mean, it may achieve something. That is the expectation, but it's all not in not a reality as on now anywhere.
Okay, sir, sure. Yes, next we have another question from Prachul Shastri madam. She says, are there any independent agencies that inspect and ensure safety of nuclear power production? Are they accountable to Parliament?
There is the Atomic Energy Regulatory Board in India, of course, which is, so there has to be, I mean, there is an IAEA requirement that the regulatory agency should have functional independence from the energy producing agency, which is important, right? Because if you have an agency which is regulating, they should not be part of the agency that's producing energy. In India, that is not the case, because the Atomic Energy Regulatory Board, effectively is not independent of the Department of Atomic Energy. So this has been a significant problem that many critics have pointed out, and many people have pointed out, that the Atomic Energy Regulatory Board is not really independent. And that is the board that is meant to ensure that safety norms and so on are followed. Now in India, there has, because of this talk and because of this criticism, there have been moves to have some legislative framework for an independent nuclear safety regulatory authority. And so a nuclear safety regulatory authority bill was introduced in Parliament many years ago. I think 9 years ago it lapsed. It was introduced again, and it lapsed again. So this is the bill that has not come to fruition. And I think it is a serious problem. Because we were talking about safety protocols and how even if all safety protocols are followed, accidents may happen. But in India, there is a glaring problem, which is that there is no functional independence of the regulator from the Department of Atomic Energy. And there seems to be no will to even create the minimal legislative framework to have a truly independent regulation in India. So I think that is a problem. I mean, the DAE will say, if you ask them, that AERB is completely independent and so on, but that is not the right answer. One can't say there really needs to be true independence, which is legislatively granted, and autonomy in terms of functioning and personnel and people and finances, which the Atomic Energy Regulatory Board does not have.
Yeah, that is true. That is true.
Okay. So the next question is from Rajni ma'am. She asks, how do we sensitize children on war, whether nuclear will be used in the future or not? Given that war hysteria has been created very often, we have seen it in our country and recently in other countries as well. We have seen the tension. So, what message would both of you give to the future generation or the youngsters that are upcoming?
Please answer, Mr. Joseph. Please go ahead.
Yeah, you have seen in Hiroshima, a very small bomb was dropped. Now today, the weapons or the nuclear weapons are thousands of times more potential than that. Then you can imagine what will be, say, if a nuclear device is used. So it's, and several thousands of these devices are, bombs are stored in different countries. It's really a threat to humanity. Definitely, it is the people. It is necessary to oppose this warmongering, and this weaponization. As you see, in most of the most of the countries say they are spending 30 to 40 or 50% of their budget for military. For education and health. What is the percentage? It's a big question actually. So these are questions. These are to be questioned by the people. Yes, that can. That will happen only when people mobilize and it builds up a big movement. It's not just it cannot be enforced by small force. So it needs a big movement. Yes, say the March for Science movement is a small beginning in that direction. Yes, science for human benefit. For the benefit of mankind, not for weapons, not for misuse. That demand has to be popularized. That has to become the demand of the people. The military budgets. People should demand the cut of military budgets all over the world. Yes, and force the governments to give up this, particularly the nuclear weapons. Yes.
Yes.
I just want to add to that. Please?
Yes.
I think I want to take the example of the current COVID-19 pandemic. It is important, I think, for the following reason. Many times people think, there are all these thousands of nuclear weapons and so much risk of nuclear war, but it will never happen. Only some peace activist people, some crazy people like us or whatever, only we worry about nuclear war, but actually, it will never happen. That's what people somehow think. But I think what the pandemic is showing us is that risks sometimes come home. And even though modern society looks like it is so stable and so on, these risks can really bring the society to its knees. People warned about public health issues and about issues of the pandemic, and they were ignored in the same way. And we see in some sense what has happened. And the pandemic is something that will pass. Society will survive the pandemic. But the nuclear weapons can have much more serious issues. So, we should not ignore risk. The pandemic teaches us that risk should be taken seriously. I think there is one more thing the pandemic teaches us, which I think I think it's a good way to teach this to children. When we speak of the welfare of people, nuclear weapons are not guaranteeing the welfare of people. The United States has the largest nuclear arsenal in the world. It has not helped it, stop having millions of cases, or it has not saved the lives of hundreds of thousands of its people. Same with India, we have a huge army and all these nuclear weapons. But if we are not able to provide basic public health measures and we are not able to provide healthcare to people, then we are not able to provide welfare to people. So welfare is not measured by nuclear weapons, do not guarantee security. In fact, they're largely irrelevant to security. Security comes from a focus on more basic human needs and on welfare. And I think children can understand this. And I think we should use the current time to make this point forcefully.
Yes, sir. True. So, lastly, a question from my side. What would you say, it's important for the children to know about nuclear fission and nuclear fusion reactions. But I think I personally feel that these should come with a disclaimer on how to use. So, what would you say about this, sir? Like, is it necessary that the children should learn about these reactions? And if there is a better energy that can be created from nuclear fission reactions probably in the future, would you say that is going to be useful for mankind, or is it going to be as harmful as the nuclear power plants that we have now?
No, I think children should certainly learn about it. As terms of scientific knowledge, we cannot forget it. It is important scientific knowledge, and it is, nuclear physics as science has led us to understand many interesting things about how fundamental physics works. So as science, I don't think, we cannot forget it. The issue is not the knowledge of the science. The issue is how it is used and applied. And so, in fact, I think the thing that children should learn, that they don't learn, or not children, but students of science should learn, is sometimes students of science are taught that social responsibility is not for you. You don't have to think about it. And this is sometimes even glorified. I remember reading Feynman's book when I was an undergraduate student. And in that book, he has a line, surely you're joking, in which he boasts almost. He says, I have a powerful sense of social irresponsibility, which is what John von Neumann taught me. In that if you do something, you are not responsible for the consequences of what happens. It was in the same context of this nuclear weapons. And that, I think, is the wrong attitude. We should not glorify the idea that science is somehow separate from society. And, under our undergraduate students and graduate students, we should learn to think of the social consequences of our actions. And that, I think, is the important thing. We should not forget the science, but when we think of using it, we should think also of its social consequences. That is what I feel.
George, sir, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so nowadays, see, in the schools or in the education system, children are, who take natural sciences, they do not study history or literature. They don't take much interest, and it's also taught in that way. And again, students of social sciences, they don't take interest in natural sciences. But actually, the method of science, which was developed, of course, in the case of natural sciences, but that method, of course, developed by Bacon. Bacon was not a natural scientist. Bacon, Descartes, the method of science that was developed, that is the way of analyzing based on experiments, verification, observation, experiments and verification. This is required in all fields, including social sciences. So that's what in my talk, I was telling that the social issues, that also has to be addressed. That also has to be probed. The working of the society also has to be probed through the method of science. So science is the only tool before mankind to solve the problems of the society and advance.
Yes, sir. Both of you have given very insightful points, and it's almost 8:30 right now. So we have had a complete overview of what nuclear energy means, right from the history of how nuclear power plants came about, how it went on, how these equations of Einstein has contributed towards the possibility of these nuclear reactions and nuclear power plants coming up. So towards that history, and then we have gone into the present situation of how nuclear power plants right now, they are doing in our country. There is this issue of waste, and not only that, but Suvrat sir has given a deeper insight of what other factors that come into establishment of a nuclear power plant and how it can affect the the electrical power industry and the other things, other factors that come into play. So it has been a very wonderful discussion, sir. I think we have covered almost all points in this discussion. So I wholeheartedly thank Professor Suvrat sir and George Joseph sir for joining us today on this occasion, 4th anniversary occasion of India March for Science. So with that, I think we can conclude. Thank you and stay safe.
Thank you.